Continuing on with Chapter 20, we're looking at the start of the Civil War between North and South from 1861 to 1865. Now, beyond just the northern and southern differences in strengths and weaknesses, obviously there is a major difference between the two presidents of the time, between Abraham Lincoln and Lincoln Douglas, the president of the Confederacy. First and foremost, Lincoln Davis's major problem was that the Confederate Constitution, extremely reliant on the U.S. Constitution, heavily borrowed from the U.S. Constitution, couldn't logically deny the right of secession, which is going to be somewhat of an issue simply because while fighting this war, Jefferson Davis, had to focus on maintaining control over his country, so domestic issues, while at the same time trying to fight the foreign United States. So that is going to be one problem, because anytime he could do something that the southern states didn't like, there could be this threat of secession within the Confederacy. Another major problem that Jefferson Davis had, now remember, he had been Secretary of the War before, he was a longtime member of Congress prior to that, he absolutely wanted a strong central government. And in fact, from his perspective, this is going to be the only way to win the Civil War, was through control by this strong central government. Well, the problem is the Confederacy, for a large part, was founded on this idea of states' rights. So here's Jefferson Davis looking to win this war, trying to maintain a strong central government, but at the same time you've got so many states' rights advocates that it became difficult to manage both sides. And so as a result of this, he was not as popular with his Confederate Congress as he could have been. He was often arguing with them, and there had even been talk during the Civil War of impeaching Jefferson Davis. So it was too much for him to deal with. He had to deal with both the civil government, or what was going on domestically, and also the military. So it was a very difficult situation for Jefferson Davis to be in. Abraham Lincoln, on the other side of the equation, while he did obviously face crazy problems, probably one of the most stressed out presidents of the day, dealing with a civil war, he didn't face the same problems that Jefferson Davis had to face with, simply because the United States government was already a stable government. It was tried and true. It had already succeeded for a really long time. Internationally, the U.S. government was prestigious, way more so than the Confederacy. And financially, the U.S. was already set as compared to the Confederacy. So therefore, it's going to be easier to attract trading partners overseas. It's going to be easier to get loans from foreign governments, because there isn't a fear that the U.S. government is going to collapse. There is a real fear that the Confederacy could possibly collapse. Okay. Now, Abraham Lincoln, even though he is one of the most beloved presidents of all time, he had his fair share of detractors during his time in office, and even to today, simply because there was example after example after example during his tenure in office of denying civil liberties, defying the Constitution. From his perspective, he said, all of this is being done to save the Union. These abuses are temporary. But from an opponent's perspective, he was creating a dictatorship within the United States by taking on way more power than he actually had a right to do. And so, for example, when this war broke out, Congress wasn't in session, and so Abraham Lincoln, using his power as commander-in-chief, ordered the blockade against the South. Some detractors said that this was only the power that Congress had. However, this was eventually upheld in the Supreme Court. But what he is doing here is expanding presidential power. He also increased the size of the army. Once again, this has been a job reserved to Congress prior to this, so he is expanding the power of the presidency. He also directed his Secretary of the Treasury to pay $2 million to private citizens in order to buy military goods and services. This is all done without an appropriations bill from Congress. Congress is the one that's supposed to handle the money. But here's Abraham Lincoln wielding his presidential powers like no president prior to this. We've already talked about the suspension of habeas corpus in the state of Maryland, simply to maintain gain control over them. Anti-unionists were arrested and thrown in jail. The Supreme Court ruled that only Congress had this power. In the other border states, we see supervised voting going on, especially during the 1864 election when Lincoln was reelected. There were colored ballots identifying which party affiliation you were choosing to vote for, and all the while armed guards monitoring these elections, obviously adding a little bit of intimidation to the process. And any newspaper that spoke out against the war, against the government, was arrested for obstructing the war, newspaper editors thrown in jail, and newspapers suspended. Obviously, once again, thus violating people's right of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now, for both the United States and the Confederacy, how are we going to call together an army? So volunteers were required in the United States from each state. So each state had a quota to fill based on their population size. However, by 1863, this quota for volunteers was not enough. The United States needed more soldiers, and so in 1863, for the first time ever, the U.S. Congress passed the federal conscription law. Another word for conscription is the draft, requiring military service of adult men in the United States. One of the major abuses with the federal conscription law was the usage of the $300 men, as they were called. If you were wealthy enough, or if your number got called, if your name got called in the draft, and you were wealthy enough, you could pay $300 to pay a substitute to go in your place. These $300 men obviously were very, very wealthy, and so this brought on a lot of detractors saying, this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. That here are the rich sending us off to fight and die, but they're not the ones doing it themselves. And so in the city of New York, now remember, New York is a Democratic stronghold. Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York City, is a Democratic powerhouse, using those Irish immigrants to their advantage to pass local legislation that they need. However, the Democrats in New York City, aside from not being very friendly towards the Republicans in the federal government, are heavily occupied by the Irish. And if you remember from past chapters, the Irish are constantly in competition with free African Americans for the lowest paying jobs in society. And so from a poor Irish immigrant's perspective in the city of New York, why are we being required to go to war? Why are we being drafted for a war that we don't believe in, who many people thought was just an abolitionist war? Here's this Republican president forcing us into military service to go and fight and die for African Americans. This resulted in a 3-day draft riot in the city of New York until finally the Union Army was called in to put this rebellion down. Beyond that, though, we also see bounty brokers and bounty jumpers, another way to ensure that the United States continue to have enough volunteers, what's the word I'm looking for, prize was given to sign up. You were given a bonus to sign up. So bounty brokers made a living by signing people up, by traveling all over the United States, even overseas, to sign people up for service, and they took a cut of that bonus. Bounty jumpers, on the other hand, are people that would sign up for service and then desert, taking their money with them, oftentimes going to another city to sign up to get that stipend and then deserting as well. In the end, it is estimated that about 200,000 Union soldiers deserted and 200,000 Confederate soldiers deserted during the Civil War. Now, from a Confederate's perspective, they are a less populated country. Remember, only 9 million people to work with. And so conscription started much earlier in the Confederacy in 1862. And they had a, quote, cradle-to-grave policy when it comes to the soldiers that they would accept into their army. Anyone between the ages of 17 and 50 were fair game to be sent into military service. And similar to what we saw in the North with the $300 men, the Confederacy had their own exemption for slave owners or overseers of 20 or more slaves. So if you owned 20 or more slaves or were an overseer on a plantation where there were 20 or more slaves, you were exempted from military service. Once again, adding some real flavor to this idea that this is a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. As Andrew Johnson said, he was the vice president under Lincoln after 1864 and obviously became president when Lincoln was assassinated. Here you see a depiction of the draft riot. Beyond this, there being anger of it being a war that they are required to fight, there is absolutely an anti-black sentiment to this draft riot as well. Here you see a political cartoon depicting Lincoln beating up the Constitution and trampling on the U.S. flag. Now, from a Southern economic perspective, the South was completely crushed financially during this war. Prior to the war's start, they accounted for about 30% of the U.S.'s wealth. By 1870, now mind you, this is 5 years after the war was over, they were only 12% of the U.S.'s economy. They were completely decimated, economically speaking. Beyond just their economy, and aside from this being a total war where as the Northern soldiers marched south, specifically I'm thinking of General Sherman's march to the sea, burning everything down in his path, aside from the physical destruction during the war that accounted for this Southern economy downfall, with the end of the war also came an end to slavery. Emancipation meant 4 million slaves all of a sudden are free. Well, if the majority of your wealth is tied up in slavery, it's going to take generations to get back from this, economically speaking. The infrastructure was completely destroyed. Remember, as the Northern soldiers marched south, they burned crops, they burned railway lines, they burned whole cities to the ground. Also, Southern soldiers would also destroy their own infrastructure as well, oftentimes in order to build a railway line or to connect a railway line or to repair a railway line. They would tear up another one to try to fix the other one in the heat of the moment, etc. This obviously was going to take a long time to repair after the war. But when all was said and done, and in the next chapter we're going to take a look at the actual war effort here, when all was said and done, the Northern society had won. This discussion over states' rights versus a strong central government was over. Strong central government absolutely won out. States' rights, while still important to today, is nowhere near at the same level as it had been back in 1860, 1861. With the end of the Civil War, the South was a conquered territory and were treated as such during military reconstruction, which we'll talk about in Chapter 22. Here you see a naval battle in 1864. And this is just a cute little artifact from the fair in Chicago. Any holder but a slaveholder. I just think that's fun. And that is it for Chapter 20.